Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, from time to time, I love to dive into some American Civil War content. It's one of my bread and butter topics, something I just wrote a book about. If you haven't already seen the book, it's called Trumbull County Boys. It is available on Amazon in paperback or in hardcover. And one of the chapters in Trumbull County Boys, I talk about Andersonville Prison, because some of the guys from Company H of the 20th Ohio ended up at Andersonville. In fact, there were something like 50 guys from the 20th Ohio as a whole that were captured just in July of 1864 at the Battle of Atlanta, and most of them ended up at Andersonville Prison. So we're going to dive into a video today that is from a channel that I don't think I've reacted to yet. Today I found out it is one of the bazillion channels that Simon Whistler is on. And this one's called The Forgotten American Civil War Death Camp. Now, I would argue off the top of my head that Andersonville is the one Civil War camp that isn't forgotten when it comes to POW camps. There's a lot of other ones that are worth talking about. There's Elmira, and there's Camp Douglas, and there's Camp Johnson, and there's Point Lookout, Maryland, and there's Libby Prison. There's some really good ones we're talking about, and we'll probably talk about those at some point. But for now, I had to restart this part of the video because we had a little problem. But want to thank Nick Aguilard for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
On November the 10th, 1865, Henry Wirz, the commander of Andersonville Prison in Georgia, aka Camp Sumter, was executed for his actions during the Civil War. A Swiss immigrant, Wirz was the only Confederate officer convicted and put to death for war crimes. Even Confederate...
Not exactly true. There were a couple of other Confederate officers that were convicted as well. They just weren't executed directly by the federal government in Washington, D.C. One that comes to mind is Champ Ferguson, who was executed for some crimes that involved the massacre of black soldiers in Saltville, Virginia, which is in southwestern Virginia, after the Saltville raid, which was a raid by Stephen Burbridge and others from, well, there were two raids, and I did podcasts about these, but they were raids into southwestern Virginia to get at Saltville, which was a production facility for salt for the Confederate government, which was really, really important to the war effort. And after they fell back, some of the black soldiers who were a part of one of those raids were left behind in a hospital, and Champ Ferguson and some others came in and they slaughtered a bunch of them, and he was executed. I think there was another execution that was done by one of the states, maybe Kentucky or Tennessee, but Wirz was the high-profile one because of how high-profile Andersonville was, how many soldiers died there. We're talking nearly 13,000, and because it was done by the federal government in Washington, D.C.
President Jefferson Davis ultimately got off more or less scot-free. You can see our video, Whatever Happens to Jefferson Davis, for more on that one. There will be a link below. Built in 1864, Andersonville, or Camp Sumter, was the largest Confederate military prison. The original plan was to move the prisoners out of Richmond, Virginia, to an area of greater security and a better food supply. The camp was operational for only a little over a year, but during that time, over 45,000 Union soldiers were incarcerated.
So you see John Ransom, the name there, and he kept a diary, as it mentions, and his diary, along with some records that were kept and smuggled out of Andersonville concerning the guys who died there, were invaluable in understanding exactly what happened there.
Out of those, a full 13,000 perished from disease, starvation, exposure, and the general horrible conditions at the camp.
Yeah, this was a camp that was designed to hold maybe 8,000 or 10,000, and at its height in August of '64, it's got like 30,000 men, and you've got this tiny little stream that barely has any water running down through the middle of it, which doubles as latrine and water supply, at least until this, what's known as Providence Spring, after a lightning strike, ends up giving them some fresh water from the ground, which was huge. They also have no shelter. They're mostly laying out exposed in the southwest Georgia sun in the middle of the summertime. It's just pretty much your worst nightmare. No food, men being killed by crossing the deadline, all that stuff.
The first prisoners came to Andersonville in early 1864. Over the next few months, around 400 more arrived every day. At its peak, 33 prisoners were held in an area that was originally built to hold about 10,000.
I think did he say 33? 33,000 he meant.
A small stream was the only source of water for prisoners, and it became a toxic cesspool of waste being used for the latrine, the garbage dump, including for 2 Confederate camps nearby, bathing, and drinking water.
Yeah, that's the other thing about that, is not just that it was latrine. There are pictures of the Union soldiers using their own latrine area, but the Confederate camps were upstream from there, so everything that they were doing with the water and in the water was then flowing down to the camp.
Plans for barracks were scrapped due to a lack of resources, and the men's only shelter was scrap wood and blankets on the ground. A prisoner from Michigan named John Ransom wrote in his diary, "With sunken eyes, blackened countenances from pitch pine smoke, rags, and disease, the men look sickening. The air reeks with nastiness." Sergeant Major Robert H. Kellogg described his first impression upon being imprisoned at the camp on May 2nd, 1864. "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fall within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnestness, 'Can this be hell? God protect us.' And all thought that he alone could bring them out alive from so terrible a place." In the center of the whole was a swamp occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits, and a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the grounds, the center rising from which was suffocating. The grounds allotted...
Now you have to understand, when he uses the word sink, they're typically talking about latrine. It's the toilet when they say the word sink there. And interestingly, we don't have a ton of photographs taken of enlisted men in the South during the American Civil War. Most of the photographs we see are taken in the North or in Northern armies. But there is a series of photographs that were all taken on the same day of Andersonville Prison, right around the time when it was the worst, that gives us some real glimpses into what exactly this whole place looked like.
To R90 was near the edge of this plague spot, and how we were to live through the warm summer weather in the midst of such fearful surroundings was more than we cared to think of just then. Reverend William Hamilton, who worked at the camp for a time, noted of his first impression of the facilities, "I found the stockade extremely filthy, the men all huddled together and covered with vermin. I found the hospital almost as crowded as the stockade. The men were dying there very rapidly from scurvy, diarrhea, and dysentery. They were not only covered with the ordinary vermin, but also maggots. They had nothing under them at all, except the ground."
And you look at the photographs, they showed the one photograph. I mean, the only way you can describe what some of these men look like is 1940s concentration camp. I mean, that's what these guys looked like, the ones that survived. You can only imagine what the ones were like that died.
The man overseeing all of this was the aforementioned Henry Wirz. Wirz moved to Louisiana from Switzerland in 1849 and became a physician. When the Civil War began, he joined the 4th Louisiana Battalion. Wirz was acting as a prison guard in Richmond, Virginia, after the First Battle of Bull Run, when Inspector General John Winder promoted him to working with prisoners of war. His duties included...
So there's some evidence that Wirz may have actually served in the Army. I think the Battle of Seven Pines, he claimed to have, that's where he gotten wounded, and he had one arm that didn't really work very well. So he may have actually fought in the field before he served in prison duty.
Commanding a prison in Alabama, handling prisoner exchanges with the Union, and escorting POWs around the South. After an official trip to Europe, Wirz was given the task of running the new prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia, called Camp Sumter. Andersonville had precious few resources, and as the Confederacy's chances for victory began to wane, their already meager stores of food and medicine also dwindled. The soldiers and civilians of the South were having a hard time getting enough to eat as it was. Providing for prisoners of war wasn't exactly top of their priority list. This particularly became a problem for the South when the Union refused to continue prisoner exchanges in 1864. The reasoning behind this was that the Union Army knew that among the many resources the South was lacking at the time, manpower was high on the list. Thus, by keeping any captured prisoners, they not only diminished the South's supply of soldiers, but also put extra strain on their resources via the South having to support more Union POWs.
So Grant becomes General-in-Chief in March of 1864. And he, as a former quartermaster, fully understood the logistics game, and he understood the math. And this has been spun to say that Grant wasn't actually a good general, but only won because he understood the math. No, he was an excellent general, one of the best the United States has ever had. But you combine his excellent generalship with his understanding of the situation strategically and logistically. And he understood the math not only of supplies, but of manpower, of material, all of that stuff, putting pressure on all fronts at the same time, but also reducing the South's ability to field armies. And that meant don't give them their men back that we've captured. For example, after Vicksburg surrenders, you've got 30,000 prisoners, and they get paroled. They don't get sent to Union prison camps like the ones that were captured at Fort Donelson had. No, they're paroled. They're sent home with the idea that until they're exchanged on paper, they're not allowed to re-enter the Army. Well, a lot of them never did re-enter the Army, but some of them did, and some of them didn't wait to be exchanged. And so they're not going to make that same mistake again in '64. But there's another factor here as well, which is that the Confederacy refused to acknowledge that black soldiers were equal to white soldiers as far as a black private and a white private are equal when it comes to exchanges. Because the way exchanges worked was Confederates have a Union private. The Union has a Confederate private. You exchange those one for one. A certain number of privates are worth a certain number of corporals, sergeants, et cetera, and there's a formula to all of it. But they wouldn't consider black soldiers equal in that way, and Grant refused to deal with a Confederacy that wouldn't do that.
Little did they know of the horrible price the POWs in the South were paying. Unsurprisingly, when the conditions at the camp were widely discovered by Northerners, they were less than pleased. Poet Walt Whitman, after getting a look at some of the survivors of the camp, wrote, "There are deeds, crimes that may be forgiven, but this is not among them."
Now, it's fair to say that there were northern prison camps where Confederate soldiers did not have the best conditions either. Nothing like Andersonville. But Elmira, New York, for example, it was pretty bad at times.
After the war, Captain Henry Wirz was charged with conspiring with other Confederate officers to impair and injure the health and destroy the lives of federal prisoners, and murder in violation of the laws of war. While it's true that the prisoners under Wirz's command were ill-treated to the extreme, it isn't clear whether any of this was Wirz's fault or if he could have done anything to improve the situation, and today many historians consider him more of a scapegoat than anything else.
I think there's some truth to that. There is also some truth to the buck stops here. Now, as far as supplies go, he wasn't going to have access to a lot of food to be able to feed these guys. But there were things about that camp that could have been improved. I mean, the idea that a prisoner puts his hand past the deadline. So they had this deadline, which was an area inside the walls. So there were two sets of walls. And then inside the inner wall, you had like a fence line that was, just imagine 8-10 feet of blank space between the inner wall and then this fence. And you could go up and over the fence if you wanted to. But if you put any part of yourself past that deadline, between that deadline and the wall, you could be shot. And some of these guys would be egged on by Confederate guards to tempt fate in that way, and they would end up getting shot. I mean, there were those kinds of things. The situation with the Raiders, which if they don't talk about, I'll talk about at the end, the situation with the Raiders. That should have been dealt with a lot sooner, and it wasn't. I mean, there were definitely things Wirz could have done differently. Did he deserve to be executed for it? I don't know.
In fact, Wirz's attorney would later note that the night before his execution, Wirz was supposedly offered a deal. If he would implicate Confederate President Jefferson Davis as the responsible party for the war crimes committed at the camp, Wirz would be pardoned. Wirz told his attorney when learning of this offer, "Mr. Shade, you know that I have always told you that I do not know anything about Jefferson Davis. He had no connection with me as to what was done at Andersonville."
And you give Wirz credit for this, that he was being honest. He had an opportunity to get out by blaming somebody else, somebody he didn't even know, but he wasn't going to do it. He was a captain. He had connection with guys like Winder. He didn't have connection with the president of the Confederacy at that point.
"If I knew anything about him, I would not become a traitor against him or anybody else, even to save my life." Of the 160 witnesses who gave testimony in Wirz's trial, many came from former prisoners describing the abhorrent conditions in the camp. Some blamed Wirz for this, even noting that he personally treated prisoners violently and occasionally withheld food for no good reason, but other survivors stated that Wirz simply hadn't been given the resources to adequately provide for the prisoners. Needless to say, it was difficult to separate fact from fiction in the trial. Perhaps the most notable witness in Wirz's defense was Robert E. Lee, who noted that, in his opinion, Wirz had done the best he could with the extremely scant resources that he was given. Further backing up this notion was the angel of Andersonville, Father Peter Whelan. Whelan had worked at the camp for several months from sunup to sundown, helping prisoners in whatever way he could, including...
And you have to say that when you have someone like this who is doing what he can, to me, his testimony carries a lot more weight. Because I would think he would be someone who would be more fair in his observations.
Attempting to leverage what small resources the local Catholic churches had to help the POWs. More notably, Whelan personally borrowed $16,000 in Confederate money from one Henry Horn of Macon to acquire approximately 10,000 pounds of wheat flour, which was then baked into bread and distributed among the starving prisoners. One former prisoner of Andersonville said of Whelan, "All creeds, colour, and nationalities were alike to him. He was indeed the Good Samaritan."
Good for him.
Sergeant John Vorter went on to state that of all the ministers in Georgia accessible to Andersonville, only one could hear this sentence: "I was sick and in prison, and you visited me."
So this is actually a quote from a parable that Jesus gives in the Gospels, where he talks about a person who says, "I was sick and you visited me. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was in prison and visited me. I was sick and you cared for me." And then people will say, "Lord, when did we see you in prison and visit you? When did we see you sick and care for you?" And Jesus says, "Whatever you did for the least of these you did for me." So they're quoting the Gospels directly there and just pointing out how this Catholic Peter Whelan lived that out, which is high praise for him.
As that one is a Catholic Peter Whelan. Whelan, along with the aforementioned Reverend Hamilton, who also worked in the camp, stated that apart from yelling at prisoners on occasion, such as swearing at new prisoners and threatening to shoot them if they tried to escape, they had never witnessed nor heard Wirz himself inflicting any physical harm on any prisoner.
And I think that's powerful testimony right there.
This is something they felt they would have known about had it happened, given their daily life of going around talking with the prisoners. That said, punishments in the camp for breaking rules were reportedly severe, though it's not clear whether they were any different or more severe than any other POW camp in the war. They also stated that Wirz had been eager for their help in the camp, and in their opinion, he was simply a man who was given far too few resources to manage his charges. Beyond evidence Wirz produced at his trial showing that he pleaded with his superiors on several occasions for more supplies to improve the conditions in his camp, in July of 1864, Wirz conscripted 5 of his prisoners and sent them north to appeal to the Union to reinstate the prisoner exchanges, telling them to describe to the Union officials the appalling conditions in Andersonville.
I think that's also very powerful testimony that he went out of his way to send Union prisoners north to beg them to do something so that he didn't have. I mean, July 64 is when Andersonville's getting at its worst. He's in a tough spot, and I just have a hard time thinking that he could have done a whole lot more than he was doing for this situation. Now, a couple of things while I'm thinking about it that are worth checking out. There was actually, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, a TV movie made about the trial of Henry Wirz, and I believe William Shatner is in it, among other people. And there's also the fantastic TNT series Andersonville that tells the story of the camp through the eyes of a few fictional soldiers, and I think it was really, really well done.
To corroborate this story, he also had many other prisoners sign a petition. Unfortunately, the Union rejected the appeal, and Wirz's attempt to reduce the population of his prison camp failed. So while it's difficult to determine today whether Wirz was really the villain he was ultimately portrayed as, it is at least clear he was something of a sacrificial lamb and a focal point for Northern anger.
Yeah.
Among his final words were, to the commanding officer overseeing his execution on November the 10th, 1865, "I know what orders are, Major. I am being hanged for obeying them." And now for some bonus facts. In the late 1860s, close to death, Father Whelan finally managed to pay off the debt that had incurred borrowing money for wheat for the POWs. He first petitioned Edwin Stanton, the Union Secretary of War, for the funds, but Stanton replied that he would need documented proof of the purchase of the wheat flour given to the Union POWs. Whelan noted that he had neither the health nor the strength to run over Georgia to hunt up vouchers and bills of purchase. As his health continued to decline due to a lung disease, Whelan's doctor recommended he travel north to a less humid environment. Donations were given to provide the funds for this trip and accommodations upon his arrival, but instead of using them to travel to a more hospitable environment for himself, Whelan used them to pay off the wheat flour debt. He ultimately died on February the 6th, 1871, at the age of 69. And now for another bonus fact. One of the earliest known instances of the term deadline appeared in the minutes of the trial of Henry Wirz. It reads, "And he, the said Wirz, still wickedly pursuing his evil purpose, did establish and cause to be designated within the prison enclosure containing said prisoners a deadline, being a line around the inner face of the stockade or wall enclosing said prison and about 20 feet distant from and within said stockade."
So if you want to see what this actually looks like, at the very end of this video, I'll put up on the end screen, but I'll also put down in the description a link to the video that I made at the Andersonville prison site. It's one of the earliest vlogs I ever did for this channel, and it gives you a real look at not only the stuff we're talking about, but the entire grounds, the National Cemetery, all of it.
And so established said deadline, which was, in many places, an imaginary line, in many other places marked by insecure and shifting strips of boards nailed upon the tops of small and insecure stakes or posts. He, the said Wirz, instructed the prison guards stationed around the top of said stockade to fire upon and kill any of the prisoners aforesaid who might touch, fall upon, pass over, or under, or across the said deadline.
And there were at least a few stories of men who were in such awful condition that they kind of made a decision to take their own lives by crossing the deadline on purpose.
So I really hope you found that video interesting.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Raiders. So if you visit Andersonville National Cemetery today, you'll see the 13,000 or so graves of the men who died there. But off in one little section, you'll see a small group, I think there's 6 of them, that are by themselves in a slightly segregated part of the National Cemetery. And if you go there at Memorial Day, you'll see there's no flags on those graves. And these are the men that are known as the ringleaders of the Raiders. So early on in the history of Andersonville Prison, there were a group of Union prisoners who started taking advantage of the other prisoners. They basically saw it as the strongest will survive kind of thing. It was like us or them. And so when new prisoners would come in, fresh fish as sometimes they get called, they would lead them to an isolated part of the camp. They would ambush them. They would rob them. They would beat them. In some cases, kill them. And this went on for months until this group of Union soldiers that called themselves the Regulators went and got permission from Captain Wirz to deal with these raiders. And they led a raid and basically captured the ringleaders. And they did a trial. And this is all covered in the TNT series if you want to learn more about it. And at the end of the trial, there were dozens, if not hundreds, that were sentenced to various crimes, or punishments, things like running a gauntlet, stuff like that. And these ringleaders were sentenced to be hanged because they had caused the death of fellow prisoners. And so the trial found them guilty. They hanged them. Wirz signed off on it, and those men are now in a separate part of the prison. And the Raiders, I covered them as well in my book. Most of the events with the Raiders happened just before the guys from the 20th Ohio got there, but it still would have been well known and well talked about by that point. But it just goes to show Union soldiers taking advantage of and even causing the death of fellow Union soldiers in an attempt to survive themselves. It just shows you how awful things were in that prison. All right, I want to thank Melissa Delorme and Gerald Simonovitz, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Simonowitz, for your support on Patreon. Check out the videos that I'll post here on the screen, including my tour of the Andersonville prison site. Thanks for watching.